Can video games really influence someone to commit crime?
You have to look at the internet because a lot of bad things are happening to young kids and young minds, and their minds are being formed. And we have to do something about maybe what they're seeing and how they're seeing it. And also video games. I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts.
In our morning rounds, video games and your kids, 97% of teenagers and preteens say they play them. About a third admit at least one of their favorites is rated mature or adults only, often because of the violent content. Well, a new study finds a link between violent games and aggressive behavior in children.
Across more than a few of our message boards, we've seen more than a few people raise concern over violent video games and the cultural effect of having so many young men living virtual lives as first-person shooters.
Players were tested in a variety of ways over short-term periods and long-term. In some cases, subjects were tested for 2 years. Researchers concluded that violent video game use does have an effect on aggression.
The media has pointed the fingers for years now, but before video games it was movies that influenced people to commit such terrible acts. And before that it was comic books, and let's not forget about artists like singers and rappers. Look how much stick Eminem got for his lyrical content back in the day. Or is it just simply down to the individual? The answer to these questions will be different depending on who you ask. However, there's one question I'm sure everyone can agree on. Are video games addictive? For some more than others, sure, but is it possible for someone to become so immersed in a game that they blur the lines between fiction and reality, so immersed that they could commit a triple murder? This is the story of Devin Moore. Devin Moore, birth name Devin Darnell Thompson, was born on May 15, 1985 in Fayette, Alabama. Brother to Michael Moore, an NFL player who played for Washington Redskins and Atlanta Falcons. Devin Moore is one of 6 children raised by his father Kenny Moore. After doing some research on his upbringing, there is conflicting information. Devin and his attorney Jim Stanridge say his childhood was far from normal, that Devin was emotionally and physically abused by his father. However, his father says something different. His father Kenny claims that Devin was not emotionally or physically abused and that his upbringing was the same as his siblings. He raised them all from babies and raised them with discipline, but Devin could not be taught discipline, he rebelled. Kenny's friend David Hallman also said that Kenny did a good job at raising his kids, saying, "Devin acted respectful and courteous with me, but I'm aware Kenny had problems with him because he confided in me about them." Devin was brought up the same and under the same rules as his brother, who played in the NFL. How could Kenny be blamed for his childhood when all of his siblings never turned to crime like Devin did? Kenny Moore said in an interview, "I don't care what nobody says. Devin was a troubled child. He had to spend 1 year in an alternative school. He carried a knife to school and harassed girls. He was obsessed with stealing, and Devin didn't go without. Kenny bought him the sharpest cars in town, a 1995 Cadillac DeVille and a 1985 Lincoln Continental. But Devin just wrecked them. In 10th grade, Devin moved to Jasper to live with his mother, who believed he was involved with selling drugs. Now, Kenny claimed that he told lots of people of his troubles with his son Devin, even confided in people at his church, but no one listened. Both sides of the story are out there to read, you just have to decide who to believe. It's easy to believe Devin did have a rough childhood after what he did as a young adult. However, it's hard to ignore the fact that his other siblings didn't turn out the way he did, and his father's honesty of Devin being a troubled child. Devin was a troubled child who carried a knife to school, harassed girls, wrecked cars, and had an obsession with stealing. However, there is one other obsession he had: Grand Theft Auto or Vice City.
Hey lady, you know what I'm gonna do? Something like this.
Vice City is 24 karat gold these days. We send someone down to cut ourselves a nice bang. You work for me now.
Trick for the pussy, that's why.
Yes!
Yeah. One day, I'm gonna save your ass, and you're probably gonna wanna kiss me.
GTA Vice City was released in October 2002, selling over 17.5 million copies, quickly becoming the best-selling video game of the year, with Metacritic giving it an average score of 95 out of 100. It was huge, every man and his dog had it, it attracted to people of all ages. It's said that Devin was obsessed with the game, spending hours upon hours on it. He did 3-day binge sessions playing the game day and night. With his obsessions of carrying knives, wrecking cars and stealing, the game was right up his street. Now, despite what his father said about Devin's criminal antics, he didn't actually have any criminal records. However, that was about to change. In the early hours of the morning on the 7th of June 2003, the police found Devin Moore in a vehicle that they suspected to be stolen. They brought him into the station without any troubles. Devin was being very cooperative. The officers did a background search on Devin which brought up nothing to raise an eyebrow about, but the officers realised, right near where they picked Devin up, a dry cleaning business had just been burgled. The suspect who burgled the dry cleaning business left a footprint at the scene. Officer Arnold Stickland wanted to check Moore's shoes to see if they were a match, so he went back to the room with Moore and advised him of this. Officer Arnold Stickland uncuffed Devin Moore so he could remove his shoe. Within a second of removing the handcuffs, Moore lunged at Officer Arnold Stickland and grabbed his .40 caliber Glock automatic gun, then shot twice. One shot hitting Officer Arnold Stickland in the head. The second officer on the shift that night, Officer James Crump, heard the shot and started running down the hallway towards the room, but Devin had already exited the room and met him halfway and fired 3 shots, one of the shots hitting Officer James Crump in the head. Moore then made his way down the hallway towards the door. This is where his final victim was, an emergency dispatcher named Ace Mealer. Moore turned and fired 5 shots, one of the shots hitting Ace Mealer in the head. Right after, Moore left and jumped into a police cruiser and took off. These 3 murders happened in less than 1 minute. Moore went from being cooperative to murdering 2 police officers and 1 emergency dispatcher. 3 men who went to work for another normal night shift never made it home. It's crazy to think how GTA-like this scene actually was, killing police officers, then jumping in a cruiser and heading off. After the police caught up with Moore, they arrested him and took him back to the station. When questioned about what he had just done, Moore said, "Life is like a video game. Everybody's gotta die sometime." These chilling words sparked a lot of controversy. This was no longer some young, troubled kid who did an evil act just because he's evil, but because of a video game. The families of the 3 victims filed a $600 million civil lawsuit against 2Take Interactive, Sony, Walmart and GameStop, with their attorney Jack Thompson a long-time crusader against video game violence. They blamed Sony for allowing such a game to be played on their product, and Walmart and GameStop supplying more with the game. Before the court case began, Thompson said, "What we're saying is that Devin Moore was in effect trained to do what he did. He was given a murder simulator. He bought it as a minor and played it for hundreds of hours, which is primarily a cop-killing game. It's our theory, which we think we can prove to a jury in Alabama, that, but for the video game training, he would not have done what he did." Now, Take-Two Interactive and Sony refused to talk to reporters about the case. However, Doug Lowenstein, who was representing the video game industry at the time, did. He said, "Look, I have great respect for law enforcement officers of this country. I don't think video games inspire people to commit crimes. If people have a criminal mind, it's not because they're getting their ideas from video games. There's something much more deeply wrong with the individual, and it's not the game that's the problem." During the court case, attorney Jack Thompson said some ridiculous things, such as some of Japan won't sell GTA to minors, but Sony had no problem in dumping this garbage into American kids' brains. He referred to this as Pearl Harbor 2. People were outraged by this statement, and so was the judge. The judge kicked attorney Jack Thompson off the case and wrote an 18-page letter criticising his behaviour. A First Amendment lawyer named Paul Smith, who represented video game companies, was also spoken to. He said, "What you have in almost every generation is a new medium that comes along, and is subject to almost hysterical attack. If you went back to the 1950s, it's hard to believe now, but comic books were blamed for juvenile delinquency. And I think what you have here is the very same thing playing itself out again with a new medium. If you start saying we're going to sue people because an individual out there read somebody's book or played their game and decided to become a criminal, there is no stopping point. It's a huge new swath of censorship that will be imposed on the media." I think this is a great point made. If you blame video games for such things, we will have to start blaming every other sort of entertainment that shows such acts. Whilst the case was still going on, a child psychologist named David Walsh was also asked, "Does repeated exposure to violent video games have more of an impact on a teenager than it does an adult?" David Walsh said, "It does, and that's largely because the teenage brain is different from the adult brain. The impulse control center of the brain, the part of the brain that enables us to think ahead, consider consequences, manage urges, that's the part of the brain right behind the forehead called the prefrontal cortex. That's under construction during the teenage years. In fact, the wiring of that is not completed until the early 20s. He goes on further to say that this doesn't mean that all kids who play video games turn out the same way as Devin did, but under the right circumstances it can enable it. A perfect storm kind of situation. After attorney Jack Thompson got kicked off the case, it quickly fell apart and the judge threw the case out. Now, whilst all this was happening, Devin Moore's case was still going on. Let's not forget about the murder he committed. Devin's attorney Jim Stanbridge used violent video games and PTSD from his childhood as his defence. Devin pleaded not guilty on these terms. However, during the case, the judge barred the defense from introducing evidence to the jury that Grand Theft Auto incited Moore's shooting spree. So taking this into account, Jim Stanridge had to play even heavier on the PTSD from his childhood. He brought up such things I spoke about earlier, that Devin was emotionally and physically abused. Devin continued to plead not guilty. However, the prosecution argued Moore knew what he was doing the whole time. 2 long years after the shooting, it was finally time for the jury to give their verdict. It took only 1 hour for the jury to come to a decision. On the 9th of October 2005, Devin Moore was sentenced to death by lethal injection. But that's not where it ends. Devin's attorney, Jim Stanridge, appealed the case. The appeal was heard in Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in 2012, who upheld the conviction 5-0. After this appeal didn't work, they tried to appeal to Alabama Supreme Court, and if that was to fail, the plan was then to go to the Supreme Court of the United States. But in October 2018, both Alabama and United States Supreme Courts denied the appeals. This may be confusing, but in short, they tried to appeal in every way possible to no avail. To this day, Devin Moore still faces the death penalty and is currently on death row. Right now, whilst making this video, he's been on death row for 20 years, 1 month and 9 days. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing. I'm currently at 246 subs. I'm a really small channel, so it means a lot. I have other similar videos on my channel and more coming soon.